All right, good morning. Before we get started, I want to recognize our colleague from the great state of Missouri for the prayer and the pledge. Would you please stand?
Let's go to God in prayer. God, we're just so thankful to be here today on this Business of Small Business Committee. We ask a blessing on our chair and our ranking member, that they will guide us and direct us as we question the witnesses today, and give us discernment and wisdom, God, that you will help us with our votes to lead this great nation to greater prosperity through small business, the fabric of America, God. It's through Jesus Christ I pray. Amen.
Amen.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Good morning, everyone, and I now call the Committee on Small Business to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any time. I now recognize myself for my opening statement. Welcome to today's hearing, where we'll be looking at the unacceptable amount of fraud that occurred during the COVID-19 pandemic and what can be done to recoup those stolen taxpayer dollars. During the pandemic, the SBA took an outsized role in helping America's economy. The PPP and the EIDL loan programs were incredibly important for our nation's entrepreneurs and allowed many businesses to keep their doors open throughout all the uncertainty. However, the after-action reports show that these programs were extremely susceptible to fraud. The OIG estimates that $200 billion in taxpayers' money were given out to bad actors, which accounts for almost 20% of all pandemic lending. This is completely unacceptable, and we must find ways to rectify these issues. If we keep doing business as normal, the OIG says that they will have more than 100 years of casework to go through in order to properly investigate all the loans that have been tagged as fraudulent. In the private sector, if there was an accounting hole of this magnitude, the business owner would do all he could to get his receivable back into the bank account. This committee is working to find creative solutions to do just that and recoup the stolen pandemic funds for the taxpayers. I'm proud that in our last two markups, this committee passed four COVID fraud bills, but most must be done to recover those stolen dollars. We cannot allow the American taxpayer to be on the hook for $200 billion, and we must do a better job to maintain public trust that this level of fraud was an isolated event. Now I look forward to discussing with our witnesses innovative ideas on how to catch fraud early and ensure hard-earned taxpayer dollars are being used for their intended purpose. This could mean greater use of data matching tools, improving intra-agency collaboration, or mandating more strict standards for identity verification in any program that gives out taxpayer dollars. Additionally, we must find a better way to recover stolen funds on the back end. There will always be fraudsters and criminals looking to take advantage of any government program that is giving out money, but we must have the ability to catch these bad actors and bring them to justice so they will not be able to continue defrauding the American people. Regardless of what solutions are brought to the table, it is clear we cannot continue with business as usual. Too many times in government we hear that something can't be done or that isn't how it was done in the past. Well, the private sector does not think like this. They encounter a problem, they immediately go to work, and then they fix it. I'm excited to hear from our witnesses today on new ways we can work to prevent and detect fraud moving forward. I thank all our witnesses for being here, and I look forward to this discussion. With that, I will now yield to the distinguished ranking member from New York, Ms. Velasquez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We are here today to discuss the SBA's efforts in recovering fraudulent loans and preventing future fraud. Over the past 3 years, this committee has played an integral role in examining the pandemic relief programs, which help millions of small businesses stay afloat in unprecedented times. Approximately $1.2 trillion of economic aid was disbursed through SBA's pandemic relief programs over the course of the pandemic, which much of that originating in the first 9 months of the pandemic under the Trump administration. Sorry. While there may be disagreement on the actual estimates of fraud, it is clear we need to work together to protect the integrity of SBA programs from bad actors. The SBA, under the leadership of Administrator Guzman, has taken strong steps to root out fraud in the pandemic relief programs and put strong controls in place to prevent future fraud. Earlier this year, we heard testimony from Administrator Guzman that SBA is doing just that. In 2022, SBA established a fraud risk management board aligning its practices with GAO's oversight policies. A new role was also created, the SBA Special Counsel for Enterprise Risk, to advise the administrator on fraud and risk management activities. And the agency continues to work collaboratively with the SBA Inspector General, the Interagency COVID-19 Fraud Enforcement Task Force, and the Department of Justice to recover stolen funds. With that said, we must be clear. The SBA is not an investigative agency, and it does not have a team of auditors, investigators, and attorneys, and state-of-the-art data analytics technology to root out and prosecute fraud. That is the role of the Inspector General. And it is important that we understand the difference between the missions of the SBA and the Office of the Inspector General if we are going to effectively develop policies to prevent and recover fraud. To that end, the single most important action we can take to combat fraud is to fully fund the Inspector General's budget request. Unfortunately, their budget for fiscal year 2024 was slashed from $47.7 million to $32 million in the House Financial Services and General Government Appropriations Bill. We are just days away from a government shutdown, which will limit the OIG's and law enforcement efforts to recover fraudulent funds. Put simply, this is unacceptable. We must take our responsibilities seriously. In the last Congress, I joined with Representative Lukemeyer to sponsor legislation to extend the statute of limitation for fraud in PPP and EIDL to 10 years. These two bills, which became law, sent a strong message that unscrupulous behavior will not be tolerated and that those who commit fraud will be held accountable in the years to come. But it is all for naught if we don't give the Inspector General the resources it needs. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today, and I am certainly open to new creative ideas, provided we are committed to fully funding the Office of the Inspector General and the law enforcement community. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you very much, and I will now introduce our witnesses. First witness here with us today is Mr. Richard Breeden. Mr. Breeden is the chairman of Breeden Capital Management, LLC, located in Greenwich, Connecticut. Mr. Breeden founded Breeden Capital Management in 2005, focused on taking concentrated investment stakes in mid-cap companies and supporting steps to improve shareholder value. In addition to serving as the chairman of Breeden Capital Management, he also serves as chairman of the Nominating and Governance Committee of the Board of Steris, PLC, and as a trustee of the George H.W. Bush Presidential Library. Prior to starting his company, Mr. Breeden served as the 24th chairman of the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, as well as several positions under Presidents Reagan, Bush, and Clinton. Mr. Breeden attended Stanford University, where he received his B.A. and went on to attend Harvard Law School, where he earned his J.D. Mr. Breeden, thank you for being with us today, and we look forward to the conversation that's ahead with you. Our next witness with us today is Mr. J.T. Taylor. Mr. Taylor is the Senior Director of Fraud Investigations and Operations at ID, located in McLean, Virginia. ID.me allows individuals to securely verify their identity online, helping to prevent fraud and abuse. Prior to this time, at ID.me, Mr. Taylor worked for the U.S. Secret Service as a special agent, as a supervisory intelligence operations officer for the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, and as an intelligence officer for the U.S. Navy. And Mr. Taylor went to West Virginia. They play TCU this Saturday. Didn't know if you knew that or not. Where he earned his Bachelor's of Science in Management Information Systems as well as Norwich University, where he earned his Master of Science, and Louisiana State University, where he earned his Master of Business Administration. Mr. Taylor, thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to our conversation. Next witness with us today is Mr. Dean Zerby. Mr. Zerby is the National Managing Director of Alient Group, located in Houston, Texas. As Alient Group, Mr. Zerby is responsible for monitoring tax-related legislative activities here in Washington to keep clients and staff informed and help direct Alliance Group service offerings to ensure client needs are met. Prior to his time at Alliant Group, Mr. Zerby was Senior Counsel and Tax Counsel to the Senate Committee on Finance, where he worked with the Chairman of the Finance Committee, Senator Grassley, on tax legislation. During this time on the Finance Committee, he was involved with almost every piece of tax legislation signed into law, including the 2001, 2003 tax reconciliation bills, among others. Mr. Zerby holds an LLM in taxation from NYU and a JD from George Mason University. Mr. Zerby, thank you for joining us today. We look forward to our conversation that's ahead. And I now recognize the ranking member from New York, Ms. Velasquez, to briefly introduce our last witness appearing before us today.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Linda Miller served as the Deputy Director of the Pandemic Response Recovery Committee. She's one of our country's foremost experts on preventing and detecting fraud. Prior to launching her own consulting business, she was a principal at Grant Thornton, where she led the firm's fraud and financial crimes practice. She was also the Assistant Director in the Forensic Audits and Investigative Service Group at the Government Accountability Office. She has a wealth of experience and has dedicated her career to helping organizations identify and manage fraud. Welcome, Ms. Miller, and I look forward to your testimony. Thank you.
Thank you, and again, appreciate all of you being here today. Real quickly, just as a reminder, before recognizing the witnesses, I'd like to remind them that their oral testimony is restricted to 5 minutes in length. And if you see the light turn red in front of you, it means your 5 minutes has concluded, and you should wrap up your testimony. If you go too long, I'll give it a little of this. You'll hear that, okay? I now recognize Mr. Breeden for your 5-minute opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Chairman Williams, Ranking Member Velasquez, members of the committee. I'm honored to be here and appreciate your invitation. For about 35 years, perhaps a little more, about half my life, I've been involved in efforts to combat fraud, to help victims of fraud overcome the ravages of the crimes committed against them, and in many cases to try and recover money that has been stolen from the public. I've done that in a variety of settings in both the public sector and the private sector. I worked in the White House under Presidents Reagan and George H.W. Bush, 41. And during the time working in the White House for 41, I was very actively involved, one of the principal draftsmen of the legislation known as FIREA that helped solve the savings and loan crisis, which had involved a great deal of fraud, and the legislation contained quite a few provisions intended to help recover the monies that had been involved in fraudulent loans. I was chairman of the SEC for just under 4 years, and every single day involved fighting fraud. That's what the SEC does, among other things, but it is a never-ending struggle, and in any marketplace there are people who will abuse the market, and the SEC is for every day I was there, we were involved in anti-fraud efforts. And for the last 20 years, I have administered a series of funds for victims of fraudulent activity. For the last few years, I've served as head of the Madoff Victim Fund on behalf of the Justice Department, and my firm works for both the Department of Justice and the SEC in administering funds for victims. A big part of that work is making sure to help make sure that the money in these funds makes it to the intended victims, is to make sure that we identify and block false claims. So your topic today is very important. It's near and dear to my heart, but it's important to taxpayers, to the SBA and its work, and to faith in our institutions. So it couldn't be more important. About 11.4 million loans were made in the pandemic programs. In our work over the last 35 years, I've never seen a program with fraud incidents lower than roughly 30%. If government puts up a billboard, says free money, apply here, lots of people will come. And unfortunately, not all of them are entitled to participate. So I think the estimates, we'll never know the total amount of fraud, but the estimates, even at the high end of $200 billion, could be conservative. That's just the world we live in, and I think it's important, as was mentioned, to remember the time pressure that we were under and the great, great good that these programs accomplished. And nothing in the later efforts should take away from that. The amount of fraud, the SBA has estimated $25 billion, GAO $200 billion, it could be $400 billion. We'll never know. There was an ocean of fraud, and now the question is, how much of the improper funds can we get back? There are a lot of ideas. My testimony lays out, my written testimony lays out a number of ideas, as do the other witnesses. But I think overall, the 100 years of fraud and 100 years worth of investigations, and I certainly have no problem. When I was at the SEC, we were always trying to make sure we had enough resources, and making sure that OIG has enough resources, an important question. But we don't have 100 years, and if we give them more resources, and it takes 3 to 5 years to train somebody to know what they're looking for, our time, even an extended statute of limitations will run out. So the goal to me shouldn't be, let's figure out how to get 100 years to 93 years or 86 or 72. It's how do we accomplish the most we can possibly accomplish over the next 5 years? To do that, I would say we have to supplement the resources that exist, whether at current levels or enhanced levels, but find ways to break up the caseload, bring other people onto the playing field, and use the private sector to go after some of the bad actors. I suggest in my testimony forming small groups, private sector contractors, Medicare and Medicaid do something similar. The SEC does it, the DOJ does it, other agencies do it, so I'm not certainly having something totally innovative. But in this area, I think it could pay great dividends. Most importantly, is to have a mentality of an outrageous sense of urgency here to get after this problem and get as much done as possible. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Williams, Ranking Member Velasquez, and members of the Small Business Committee, I'm honored to be here today. My name is J.T. Taylor, and I serve as the Senior Director of Fraud at IDME. Before this role, I dedicated a significant portion of my professional career to the U.S. intelligence community and the U.S. military, serving in both as an intelligence operations officer. Later, I served as a special agent with the United States Secret Service, where I led a series of pivotal domestic and international fraud and cybercrime investigations. My tenure in intelligence operations and my investigative endeavors have granted me a comprehensive and nuanced perspective on the challenges inherent to digital fraud and cyber threats. When the pandemic gripped our world, governmental bodies like the Small Business Administration and the Department of Labor stood on the front lines, swiftly allocating relief funds. However, haste led to vulnerabilities in security and identity verification. The SBA's Office of Inspector General identified worrying signs. Numerous IP anomalies pointed towards foreign intrusions and coordinated fraud attempts. The misuse of employer identification numbers was rampant, with multiple PPP loans under single EINs. Furthermore, there was a startling discovery of businesses declaring post-deadline establishment dates and recurring use of identical contact details across different applications. The funding systems supporting these initiatives are intrinsically linked with the broader business ecosystem. Conventional practices involve businesses contributing to benefit funds calibrated on their workforce size, but the massive unexpected unemployment claims threaten this balance. State debts have increased, and there's now an impending risk of businesses, particularly smaller ones, facing escalating per-employee taxes. This is a multidimensional problem with repercussions for the entire U.S. economy. The pandemic served as a double-edged sword. On one side, it unveiled the commendable resilience and adaptability of our institutions. On the other, it exposed areas where we were woefully unprepared, chiefly in the arena of cybersecurity and fraud detection. In these challenging times, states sought robust, scalable solutions. 27 states turned to IDME, which isn't just another tech company, but a leading credential service provider. Independently certified against rigorous standards set by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, IDME embodies the pinnacle of digital identity verification. Supporting a user base exceeding 113 million, the impact of ID.me on fraud prevention has been profound. Partner states witnessed transformative results. Fraud rates drastically diminished, authentic claims experienced seamless processing, and financial savings were substantial. Beyond the monetary gains, the rejuvenation of public trust in an era when faith in public institutions is fragile is invaluable. In this digital era, standards like those curated by NIST aren't optional but foundational. Overlooking these guidelines, as seen sporadically during the pandemic, leads to compromising security. In today's digital world, data has emerged as a prime commodity. Amid this landscape, data brokers, who amass, refine, and frequently monetize user information, have risen in prominence. Although they often work within current legal constraints, their vast data repositories offer a goldmine for malicious entities. The financial drain due to digital fraud during the pandemic serves as a testament to the perils posed by easily accessible data. There's an urgent need for our defense mechanisms to adapt considering this threat landscape. A comprehensive strategy that merges the strengths of both the private and public sectors is imperative. The McCombs School of Business from the University of Texas at Austin revealed that a concerning 11% of PPP loans exhibited suspicious traits. Notably, the top 12 lenders with the highest rates of suspicious loans are all fintech lenders. Given the disparity between the statute of limitations for bank fraud and wire fraud, is it imperative that Congress takes action to address the inconsistency, particularly in the context of the PPP loans? In addressing the multifaceted nature of fraud, a dual-pronged approach is essential. First, we must bolster the collaboration of data sharing across agencies. By harnessing the capabilities of the Pandemic Analytics Center of Excellence and fostering deeper ties within the private sector, we can integrate data matching earlier in the benefit payment cycle. Simultaneously, it's crucial to democratize data validation tools. The Social Security Administration's electronic consent-based Social Security number verification tool, currently exclusive to financial institutions, should be extended to approved credential service providers. Such an expansion would ensure equitable access, benefiting a broader demographic and further strengthening our anti-fraud measures. Agencies should adopt digital identity solutions, such as those perfected at ID.me, with strict adherence to the NIST 863.3 guidelines. This ensures robust identity proofing, minimizing fraudulent access, and upholding the integrity of public portals. In our collective journey to transcend the challenges of the pandemic, it's imperative that we absorb its lessons. Our trials and triumphs underscore the essence of teamwork, innovation, and unwavering commitment to established identity verification protocols. Whether it's the commendable work by organizations like ID.me or the diligent oversight by entities like SBA OIG, we've seen the potency of dedicated efforts. We are urged to build on this momentum, reinforce our defenses, honing our strategies, and equipping ourselves for impending adversities. The American people deserve benefit programs that prevent, detect, and recoup fraudulent payments. I thank the committee for this platform, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
You're going to see people coming and going. They're not leaving. We got other hearings. They'll come, they'll leave, and so forth. So if that's something that you were wondering about, that will happen. Next, I want to recognize Mr. Zerbe for his 5-minute opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member, for having me today at this important hearing about how to recover funds that were put forward in the SBA COVID relief program. I'm coming forward today to talk about a specific bipartisan solution that has had bipartisan results over the years, recovering billions of dollars in other government agency programs, namely basically rewarding and incentivizing whistleblowers to come forward and lay out the details of fraud that they're seeing. Just as a quick background on me, Mr. Chairman, you laid it, but specific to this, as you said, I worked for Chairman Grassley on the Senate Finance Committee. I wrote the IRS whistleblower law that then served as the model for the SEC whistleblower law and the CFTC and other government programs, and I now also practice as an attorney in this area representing whistleblowers. I would just say that the benefits of a whistleblower program are pretty straightforward. First of all, you have to understand in fraud is purposely being hidden. It's hidden in the nature of it. If you want to get it, you've got to get insiders with informed, knowledgeable, detailed information. That is how you uncover fraud, and study after study has shown that, and we've seen that, for instance, in the IRS programs. They didn't know beans about what was going on with offshore accounts until a whistleblower came in and blew it all out for them. The whistleblowers give you the keys to the kingdom in terms of what's going on, so they're a proven way to do it. I think in particular that it is useful for the SBA to consider this because of the resources limitations and where they're going. The idea of the whistleblower is that they are going to help the government agency, whichever it is, better target and package and go after the bad actors. In other words, when I'm filing a whistleblower complaint, I can assure you it is with a bow on it and on a T-ball in terms of what I'm trying to do, because I want to provide a narrative of what's going on. I want to provide all the documents. I want to provide everything from teeth to tail of what is happening. Why? Because I want to get the agency to move so that my client can get paid. So you're doing a lot of the lift for the agency in terms of assisting them in terms of the work. You're also doing a better job for the agency of helping them target the bad actors. Even the best government agency has a difficult time identifying, okay, who's really here. When you have the whistleblower coming in, they know who the bad actor is. They've got the goods on them, and they're much better at identifying, which actually has the positive of leaving the honest folks out there alone. So you're better targeting resources as well, too, with that. So I think with the SBA, that's good. I think another thing that's helpful here is in reading the SBIG's reports, they clearly have a culture of embracing whistleblowers, and that's terrific. They're bringing folks in, they're taking that. One of their biggest cases that they mentioned in the white paper was hundreds of millions of dollars from one whistleblower. And what you're trying to do is build that out and encourage more whistleblowers to come forward, particularly well-placed, knowledgeable, informed insider whistleblowers that are coming forward. So I think you're benefiting from the fact that the SBA already is got to welcome that forward, and you're trying to expand beyond that in terms of it. One thing I think will be music to ears, I would say this from being a staffer on the Senate side, is CBO should score this. They should score this as a revenue raiser. They've scored other whistleblower programs. The AML bill that just passed scored at $400 million. I think all these scores are low, by the way. For instance, my program, they scored it out at, I think, a few $100 million at joint tax. It's brought in billions of dollars since it came in. But they will score it, and your staff will work with them, and I'm sure get that there. Other thing I want to mention is the deterrent ability of whistleblowers. Look, when you're out there as a fraudster and all you're thinking is, well, I just got to get it by those folks over at the agency, that's one calculation. If you've got a whistleblower program, they got to say, okay, well, now I got to trust everybody else in this room. I got to trust my banker, my secretary. Any of them can dime me out. And so it changes dramatically the way the equations go of can I get away with it. It also affects their behavior. What we find in tax is that they're constricting who's involved. They try to limit what it is. So it has an impact on their behavior. It has a deterrent impact as well, too. Last thing I would just note, on a highlight, Mike Rinton goes into it more. I think 4 hallmarks for a good whistleblower program: 1, having a mandatory award program, not discretionary, have a floor and a ceiling based on the amount recovered, broadly defined. You want a dedicated payment so that the funds are there. You're not having to go run to the appropriate boys to get dollars for it. And these are standard, by the way. What I'm laying out are what we have in all the whistleblower award programs. Have an established office within OIG that wakes up thinking about the whistleblowers and is putting out the welcome mat for them. And then you have independent review. The whistleblower, look at. When you're getting very good whistleblowers, I'm getting not just, Billy in the dock room, I'm getting the vice president of tax coming forward. They are putting their life at risk in terms of doing this. They need to have confidence. It doesn't mean they're going to be guaranteed a payment, but if they're provided information, it's used, and it ends up collecting money, that they're going to get a fair shake, and that someone independently is going to look at that. It's just not to the whim. So I thank you, Mr. Chairman, for having me here today. Appreciate it very much.
Thank you very much. And now we recognize Ms. Miller for her 5-minute opening remarks.
Thank you, Chairman Williams and Ranking Member Ms. Velasquez and members of the committee. I sit here today as a former Olympic athlete, a former government executive, a former partner at a large accounting firm, and a small business owner. And I'm bringing all of those perspectives to my comments today. I spent my career working to help the government fight fraud. I led the development of the GAO framework for managing fraud risks in federal programs and worked with Congress to draft the Fraud Reduction and Data Analytics Act of 2016. When I was the partner at Grant Thornton, my team led the development of the Treasury Anti-Fraud Playbook. I sat on the task force that developed the COSO Fraud Risk Management Guide, which governs the private sector. I serve on the advisory panel of the UK Public Sector Fraud Authority, and I sit as a member of the Identity Theft Resource Center's Biometric Working Group. As soon as PPP and COVID EIDL programs were unveiled, those of us in the fraud world saw this as a field day for fraud actors. We didn't have to think about it to see how much fraud was going to happen in these programs. An example, the COVID EIDL grant program was essentially money that was known to be not need to be repaid back. Anybody that applied for that money got it without having to provide any eligibility information. And, at that point, the only thing keeping somebody from stealing that money was their own moral compass. And that's not exactly a good fraud control. At that time, the fear and desperation of America's small business was such that the decision to get this money out with few, if any, controls to verify the eligibility of the information provided by borrowers was widely accepted. Speed was the goal. From celebrities stealing PPP loans and buying luxury cars to adversarial nation-state actors executing coordinated and elaborate schemes, there were staggering levels of fraud in these programs. The finger of blame can be pointed in several directions, and it has been over the last 3 years. SBA had not seriously considered fraud risks prior to the pandemic, and it was unprepared for the breadth and sophistication of the adversary. Congress created program rules and time pressures that made it nearly impossible for the SBA to verify the eligibility of applicants. And unscrupulous lenders looked for ways to game the system and pocket outrageous profits and fees. Today, the work of clawing back the stolen pandemic loan funds is left to the SBA OIG and its law enforcement partners. As the Deputy Executive Director of the PRAC, I worked closely with Mike Ware, SBA's Inspector General. IG Ware and his team have worked tirelessly to investigate and prepare for prosecution thousands of fraud cases, and the work has only begun. Thanks to this committee, Congress has recently extended the statute of limitations on pandemic fraud to 10 years. And given the caseload, the IG is going to need at least that long to bring fraud actors to justice. For the past 3 years, the SBA's Inspector General's work has yielded a 200% return on investment. But its backlog is enormous, and the office is stretched thin. This is not the time to cut the Inspector General's budget. Funding the IG at his requested levels will ensure this exceptionally productive work can continue. But the backlog isn't just with investigators. Bringing fraud actors to justice requires prosecutors to try those cases. The U.S. attorneys are also stretched thin, and there's no shortage of high-quality cases to prosecute. Innovation in recouping pandemic loan fraud must require more than simply putting good cases on the U.S. attorneys' desks. Today's hearing is also exploring the role of identity theft in pandemic loan programs. So it's important to note that identity theft plays a role in loan fraud, but it was not the largest driver of fraud in PPP or COVID EIDL. Front-end identity verification technology, including remote biometrics, is but one tool in SBA's toolset, and it is by no means a panacea. Fraud actors created shell companies, often using stolen information to apply for loans. But this type of identity theft-based fraud is uncovered through conducting due diligence on the information in those applications, and SBA has done quite a bit more of this due diligence to date. They now require tax transcripts of loan applicants, they use vendor information to verify a bank account, and they flag certain EIN prefixes, none of which was done at the start of the pandemic. Despite these improvements, SBA does have more work to do. They have to continue to mature their preventative anti-fraud capabilities. They must adopt a culture that's conducive to fraud risk management, and they have to collaborate with their OIG to ensure that lessons learned are incorporated into their anti-fraud controls. I was a rower in the 2000 Olympics, and as such, I know a thing about teamwork. My career has straddled the public and private sectors for a reason, because I believe that the government and the private sector make a powerful team. The government relies on the private sector innovation, and the private sector requires services like Main Street saving loan programs that only the government can provide. I look forward to discussing the productive ways the private sector can assist the government in recovering loans and preventing fraud going forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and good job on the 5-minute rule. It's great. I will now recognize myself for 5 minutes. When I first heard about the $200 billion in potential fraud in the SBA pandemic lending programs, it made me think about how a business owner would act in this situation. They would have to decide whether they do all they can to collect the $200 billion that is in their book, on their books, as a receivable, or to write it off as a loss. No private entity has the luxury of writing off such a massive number, so I think it is our duty to be good stewards of the taxpayers and find ways to get this money back, which we've already begun to talk about. The SBA's Inspector General told us that they currently have over 100 years of casework if they're to investigate all the loans that have been flagged for fraud. This is obviously an impossible task, and there must be a better way to help them get this money back. So, Mr. Zerbe, during your time as senior counsel of the Senate Finance Committee, you crafted legislation under Senator Grassley to overhaul the IRS whistleblower program, as you said, and my team and I are exploring the idea of creating a similar self-sustaining program which will allow any citizen to collect a commission if they report COVID fraud that results in money returned to the Treasury. So, question is, do you think it would be possible to create this type of program that would empower everyday Americans to report fraud? And what are some of the things we should be aware of as we look to create this program?
I think that's an excellent question, Mr. Chairman. I do. I've seen it in a number of government agencies have created these whistleblower award programs. And so I think that very much SBA is a good possibility in terms of also looking at creating a whistleblower award program. You already have the key TAM, False Claims Act, where they're bringing in a few cases in right now from attorneys, from whistleblowers, and that's had some success. But I think having in parallel with that an in-house whistleblower award program will very much be a way to, as you say, commission to bring in the energy of the whistleblowers, their attorneys, their advisors, to help the SBA move forward. So yes, I think it's a very good candidate for the SBA to look at doing this, absolutely.
Great, thank you. Mr. Breeden, you are currently working as special master for the victims of Bernie Madoff's Ponzi scheme. This requires you and your team to go through massive data sets to find out what claims are legitimate and which ones are fraudulent. So the question is, can you speak on how massive financial recovery is possible when there is such a large quantity of data to go through?
Yes, sir. It's definitely a challenge. In the Madoff Victim Trust, which I administer, we have had about 70,000 claims covering $80 billion in claimed losses. We've approved about $10 billion of that. So there's always a significant difference, and some of it's legitimate and some not, between what gets originally claimed and what you end up approving after you've reviewed it very carefully. We've had data, documents, brokerage statements, and so on from victims going back 20 years, millions of pages of documents covering hundreds of thousands of transactions. And I love technological systems. Our company, our Victim Trust, we use systems to scan things all the time. But the most effective tool is an experienced person sitting looking at the analytics and deciding that there's a problem that needs greater follow-up. So big data can do a lot of things, but it isn't going to haul crooks in to identify and have someone go after them. So it's a mix of systems and trained people. And one of the problems we have today is starting now to bulk up investigative resources in the SBA, for example. That's great, but it takes 3 to 5 years to mint somebody that really knows what they're looking at. And so you've got a lag in effectiveness. I think it's still possible. We have done the Madoff work and identified thousands and thousands of improper loans, and some that were referred for prosecution and that have generated recoveries, though that's not our principal role, with a relatively small group of people. And that's why I think the combination of mini SWAT teams that are focused on recovering money and focused on reading the, out of 12 million loan files, all right, suppose you took the 100,000 largest loans and have people who know what they're looking at read the files and look at where are the cases that are best cases to prosecute.
Excuse me. I now recognize the ranking member for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Miller, we have established that the Inspector General and law enforcement are the lead organizations to investigate and recover fraudulent monies. What is the most important action that we can take to help recover stolen funds?
Well, if we want to recover stolen funds, the action needs to be focused at the IG, because the IG and the law enforcement partners of the IG are the only entities who have the authority to do investigations and prepare cases for prosecution.
You, in your opening statement, mentioned the fact that we passed the law to extend to 10 years to go after the bad actors. And through that legislation, we gave them, OIG, more time, but now they need the resources. If the OIG is not fully funded, we will not be able to capitalize on these two new laws, correct?
Correct.
Mr. Servi, IG Ware testified before our committee that their hotline produced 90,000 actionable leads that will take more than 100 years to examine. The law enforcement community has said they need more resources to investigate, prosecute, and recover fraudulent monies. How does your proposal meet the needs of the law enforcement community and improve prosecutorial outcomes?
Thank you for that. Just one quick note. When you're talking about Mr. Madoff, I can't help but note that it was a whistleblower who, Mr. Markopoulos, that revealed Mr. Madoff, just as an aside. I think that's an excellent question. I think it's twofold. When you are incentivizing whistleblowers, it's one thing to get a tip that they may get as SBA that's of some use, but these tips kind of tend to be, hey, you know, I saw a guy at a bar and he had a fancy car. I mean, they're not that useful, a lot of them. And when you're incentivizing a whistleblower and encouraging, they're going to come in with a full package. They're going to come with a lot more detail, much more robust assistance in terms of what's going on. So really helping the agency do its work, so helping them expand their work. But to your point too, and one thing to consider, maybe this is a way to split the baby, is that a number of the whistleblower award programs do allow for a partial recovery of the funds for the IG shop itself. In other words, HHS IG with the Key TAM program, they get to basically get reimbursement for their investigations. The CFTC, similarly with their whistleblower program, they get to reimburse their costs for their expenses for these whistleblower programs. So it kind of aligns everyone's behavior. So something maybe for the committee to think about of a way to finesse the issue. But that would be how it is primarily it's allowing the agency to work more expeditiously, ma'am.
Thank you. Thank you. Ms. Miller, in your view, would this proposal be a more cost-effective way to recover fraudulent funds as opposed to fully funding the Office of the Inspector General and the law enforcement communities?
I mean, I would not say that we should do that instead of fully funding the Office of Inspector General. I couldn't speak to how much that's going to improve prosecutorial outcomes, but it's possible it will cost money. You'll have to create an office and you'll have to pay those people salaries. And so, you know, the scoring
we
could come back.
At the brink of a government shutdown over the budget, right?
Right,
So,
exactly.
Okay,
Yeah.
Mr. Taylor, privacy advocates have concerns about the large amount of data ID.me collects to verify users' identities. Data like Social Security numbers, military records, bank and credit card records, biometric data, and government documents. Does your company share this data with third parties?
Thank you for the question, Ranking Member Velasquez. Appreciate it. Our privacy policy is one of the most robust in the industry. I would counter that our privacy policy is actually even more stronger than the average grocery store that you visit on a daily basis. We do not do any type of selling, trading of personal data. Additionally, from a standpoint,
So to be clear, you don't sell, you don't share this data with third parties.
that's correct, ma'am.
Okay.
No selling, trading, or
And
renting.
does ID.me benefit monetarily from the data provided by American citizens?
ID.me makes money via the actual identity verification itself and successful transactions, meaning successful identity verifications versus transaction-based.
Thank you. Mr. Breeden, based on your experience overseeing the Madoff Victim Fund, could you please share any lessons learned from your experience that could help law enforcement recover fraudulent pandemic fraud?
Well, thank you. In addition to Madoff, I did WorldCom and Enron and British Petroleum and a couple of JP Morgan cases. And so I've actually reviewed, my staff and I, about 150 people all told over 20 years have reviewed over 4 million claims to these victim funds. Sorry.
Thank you.
Up, and we can put that in writing if need be. Okay. I now recognize Representative Alford from Missouri for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, for holding this important, very important hearing today, and thank you for our witnesses, all of you, for being here. We're here for one reason and one reason only. In the words of Jerry Maguire, show me the money. This is taxpayer money we're talking about here. Congress knew that this money had to get out the door fast. We had an economic crisis from the pandemic. So the House and Senate came together to do just that. Some fraud was expected, but not $400 billion worth of fraud on the American taxpayers. I am still disgusted that Administrator Guzman would not bother to come down here and talk to us about her lower projections of fraud and what she's doing about it to get that money back for the American people. That's why we introduced 3 weeks ago the Cabo Act. We cannot get inside the Small Business Administration to go visit Ms. Guzman. We want to change that, the congressional access to bureaucratic offices. According to the Inspector General's report, 33% of all idle loans are estimated to be fraudulent. These loans were administered solely through the Small Business Administration. And I know that Administrator Guzman released a report contradicting that, but let's stick to the fraud, abuse, and misuse expert, the IG. This is in stark contrast to the PPP loans, which are only 8% estimated to be fraudulent. These were loans administered through lending partners, private businesses who could get it done right. The first step in solving any problem is recognizing that there is one and addressing the issues. Clearly, there are problems. We are here today to find answers. Mr. Breeden, I want to start with you. You talked about in your testimony a couple of quotes, remember the good in this program at the time that we had it, up to $400 billion, as we're now recognizing. You call it an ocean of fraud, which I think is very apt. Does the good outweigh the bad in this program?
I don't know that I'm qualified to answer that. I think we were faced with a crisis the likes of which in my lifetime I've never seen. It would have been nice to be tighter in how we handled it. We didn't. That's water over the dam from my perspective. The question is, how do we go after the money that was taken improperly? I've spent 20 years doing that for the SEC, for the Justice Department, and you don't do it by writing reports. You do it by taking the largest transactions, going through them, putting knowledgeable people, reviewing it, and where you find problems, refer it, get teams of prosecutors to go after it. And that seems to me, and we have to remember that the iceberg of stolen money a few years from now will be an ice cube.
Well, clearly we don't have the
time is of the
resources
essence.
to do this right now with the Inspector General's office. You're proposing the private sector fill in the gaps. Could this work with the whistleblower program, put everyone on commission, and let's get this $400 billion back?
Yes, sir. I think you could. I think that's what I'm suggesting. And other agencies supplement their internal resources with people on the outside. I have, for the last 10 years, worked for the Department of Justice. I'm not a government employee, but under contract, we work for them. We, every day, try and find fraud and refer it to prosecutors.
Are there any prosecutorial risks once we get to court with these when the private sector is involved versus someone with the government?
None whatsoever.
There you go. What do we learn from this now? Really quickly, can you give me one thing that we can improve on next time, God forbid we have another emergency like this?
A little slower, a better pace, systems knowing ahead of time you're going to have a lot of fraud and that you have to go through the data as you make each and every loan to try. It's way better for the taxpayers to stop the fraud before it happens than to go after it later.
Thank you, sir. Ms. Miller, quick question. You said you worked with the Inspector General on this. Have you met with the Inspector General?
Yes, many times.
Have you met with Administrator Guzman on this topic?
No.
Why not?
I worked for the Pandemic Response Accountability Committee, so Mike Ware, the IG, is a member of that committee, so I work closely with him. I didn't have a reason to meet with
If you happen to talk to her, would you tell her we'd really like for her to come down here and explain the differences between her number and the number of the IG and what we're going to do to get this back? Would you do that for me?
Yeah, I
Thank
have
you
some
very much.
ideas about the differences, too, I could share.
Well, thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize Representative Davis from the
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you to you and to the ranking member for holding this hearing today. As several of our witnesses have already pointed out, combating waste, fraud, and abuse of government dollars should be something that we are all interested in. The Small Business Administration's COVID-19 relief programs, like the Paycheck Protection Program and the Economic Injury Disaster Loans, certainly saved countless small businesses from closing. But unfortunately, American taxpayers and many other small businesses were victimized by fraudulent actors that stole those desperately needed funds, a total of which is estimated to be over $200 billion. And to date, the SBA and Office of Inspector General have successfully recovered about $30 billion in fraudulent COVID-19 funds. But certainly there is more work to be done. Given the unprecedented scope of these pandemic programs, we have a lot ahead of us. But I know we're currently responding to pandemic-related fraud, but we also need to be prepared to properly mitigate widespread fraud during future emergencies. And that means ensuring that our government oversight resources are prepared and utilizing the best practices that we've learned during the COVID-19 pandemic. I do think that everyone here today shares a common goal of protecting American taxpayer dollars and ensuring that we're being fiscally responsible while doing that. So before I dive into my question, I do want to thank all of our witnesses for sharing your perspectives, for your service, and making sure that we have a better understanding of how we can be better stewards of the taxpayers' dollars. So the first question, Ms. Miller, I'd like to ask you, given the SBA OIG has shared this concept of 100 years worth of pandemic-related casework to properly review the cases. I'm curious how maybe you can share some of the insights you have about how we can better prevent the fraud, waste, and abuse going forward as we look at not if, but when we face future emergencies.
Yes, and I think that's a really important point because we are talking about recovering pandemic stolen funds today, but it is water over the dam, and it's really important to prepare agencies for the future. SBA had not implemented many, if any, of the practices of the GAO framework for managing fraud risks in federal programs, which GAO issued in 2015. The Comptroller General has made comments publicly in several hearings about his disappointment that agencies didn't take that document more seriously and follow those practices. And so going forward, SBA has begun to take some steps. They've established a fraud risk management board, which is a good centralized entity that shows some commitment. But they need to continue to build, and all agencies, especially SBA and anybody that's administering a lot of direct funding to the public, preventative anti-fraud controls that use data. And that's really important. SBA has begun that work, but there is much more work for SBA and to do in the future if they want to make sure that they can be prepared for the next. And I want to make a point about the recovering funds. A lot of the funds that were stolen were identity theft funds. Those were nation-state actors. We're not going to get those back from whistleblowers or anybody else. They're gone. We're not going to get that money back, unfortunately.
And so one of the things that I did want to ask you about as well is the suggestion of incentivizing whistleblowers. I'm curious how, in your view on that, with the SBA OIG and their current capacity, housing some sort of whistleblower management office. Really quickly, if you could tell me what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I mean, they're going to have to add staff to fund that office. And so, given that the IG is already stretched, it could be, I'm really not qualified to weigh in on the cost benefit of it, but it would definitely add resources. And the SBA OIG has mentioned that he needs more resources than he already has now. So that has to be considered.
And I'm low on
If
time.
I could add, Congressman,
Oh, yeah.
one thing I would just say to that is, I don't know the details either, but I would say it may be minimal because they are already dealing with folks coming in with tips and resources in the thousands. So I don't know if it's going to need a big expansion. I'm sorry.
No, I appreciate that. In the limited time I have left, I might follow up with all of you with some of the additional questions I have, but I do want to highlight a couple of things, particularly from the voices from the private sector. One of the things that I've noticed is that some of our systems of data management and vetting probably need to be updated and upgraded, and that might also be something that the private sector could be helpful with the SBA on. From this committee's perspective, I might follow up questions on that as well. Thank you.
I now recognize Representative Bean from the great state of Florida for 5 minutes.
A very good morning to you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, Small Business Committee. I've been cheering over the weekend, so my voice is here, but I got just enough to get through 5 minutes of questions, and that's this, panelists. It's very good to see you this morning. Here's the biggest thing. We don't agree on much, but we do agree that there's fraud. We all agree on that there's fraud. Here's the numbers. Here's the discrepancy of disagreement. The Secretary Guzman says there's only $36 billion in fraud, yet Inspector Ware says maybe there's 200 to 600 billion. Which is it? Ms. Miller, you want to start us off?
Yeah, well, I think that it really depends on how you define it. So the SBA believes that certain EIDL loans and certain PPP loans should not be considered fraudulent because, for example, if an EIDL loan is in repayment, the SBA believes that a loan that's in repayment, it's illogical to consider that that loan would be fraudulent. The SBIG does not agree. So they don't agree on the terms.
Gotcha. But that number's bigger than 36 billion.
We don't know. I mean, I do think it's bigger than 36 billion.
Let me go to that. Mr. Breeden, you say that number's bigger than 36 billion.
Massively bigger.
It is. I think that is the correct answer, that it is bigger than
In
36
35
billion.
years, I've never seen a program with less than 30% roughly false claims. So that puts you at a much, much higher number.
They come out. One of the hardest things that I've had to deal with, I guess, and maybe you're familiar with it, and it's deals with Barbie. I don't know if you're familiar with Barbie. You know about Malibu Barbie or Presidential Barbie, but we now have Swindler Barbie. And I want to show you some of the actual logins that our vendors accepted as real people. And you can see behind me right now. Mr. Taylor, are you familiar with this? And if are you familiar with the scam that was run?
I am, sir. What you're looking at is masks that made it through fintech platforms.
I gotcha. Now, what can we do in the future so that Barbie or Ken, he got in on this action too, by the way, what can we do to prevent Barbie and Ken from getting in on the fraud?
At IDME, we deal with masks quite regularly. We stop them in their tracks through something called presentation attack detection, sir, PAD.
So there's software that we just didn't employ or didn't use.
That's correct, sir. We, whenever we get somebody on camera, we ensure that they're a live person.
Very good. Would it shock any of you? I just read an article this morning that Tencent, a big Chinese company that is a major investor in Wombly, which is one of our vendors, we paid them $2 billion to administer this fraud. Would that shock anybody that we paid Beijing to make sure that this fraud happens? Mr. Breeden, does that shock you?
No, sir.
Yeah, we call this crazy town for a reason a little bit. Here's just a toss-up question. I have the frustrating thing is there was talk of just letting smaller loan frauds go, just saying, you know what, we'll just let that go. But I say no. I say no, and I think everybody up here says no. I filed the We Want Our Money Back Act, which says we want our money back, and we're not going to let it go. And so I have that bill. There's other bills that say, let's extend the statute of limitations to go after it. There's another bill that says anybody that's suspected of fraud shall be prohibited from any government program until it's worked out. I think that's a great bill, too. What else do we need to do? What else do we need to do to get our money back? Ms. Miller, jump in.
Yeah, well, one thought is that you can offer amnesty to those people who pay back the money without amnesty from prosecution for those individuals that are willing to voluntarily give the money back. I suspect there are a number of people who have the money and they know that they got it erroneously, they got it fraudulently, and if they thought they were protected from prosecution, they might give it back.
I'm sorry. No, go ahead. Go.
I'd add that the IRS is facing the same level of fraud in the Employee Retention Credit Program, and the amnesty is something that they are basically putting out there to say, why don't you come in and meet Jesus and get right? So that may be something to consider as well.
10-4. Thoughts, Mr. Breeden?
Wanted dead or alive posters probably have a long history, and reward programs, whether you call them whistleblowers or something else, are certainly part of the solution. But I go back to, if you've got a problem that you think you might have had 3 or 4 million bad loans, you can't wait 100 years. So put together teams of people, parcel those out, and start looking.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I've run out of voice and I've run out of time. I yield back.
I now recognize Representative Skelton from the great state of Michigan for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for coming here to testify today about this truly important topic. And I want to start by saying that the $1.2 trillion in aid that the SBA has distributed over the course of the pandemic was truly essential, a lifeline to so many businesses in keeping their doors open. And in the context of this important discussion today, I don't want to lose sight of that. I think that there is a lot of agreement here today about the frustration over the inability to pinpoint how much fraud there was, because a lot of our constituents, many of our constituents, were struggling to make ends meet during the pandemic, and their hard-earned tax dollars were going to fund these programs. Ms. Miller, in your testimony, you state that the truth most likely lies somewhere in the middle. I am a future-oriented, problem-solving individual. You recommend that Congress establish a well-funded, more taxpayer dollars, centralized anti-fraud office. Can you elaborate on how this would allow the federal government to prepare for the next emergency and how we might be able to avoid this type of situation in the future?
Sure. Yeah, this is cross-governmental, intergovernmental agency issues are notoriously difficult to solve because every individual agency is focused on its mission and its budget. And so getting them to coordinate their activities is always very difficult. We knew this when I was at GAO. We talked about this a lot. So this is an intergovernmental problem. It crosses all of government, both federal, state, and local. You need a centralized entity within the federal government that is not the Inspector General. The IG's job is to get the money back after it's been fraudulently obtained. The agencies, like the SBA, are the ones that are responsible for preventing the fraud to begin with. But each individual agency, if working together, can do things like sharing data. Like, for example, it may not be known that the Treasury Do Not Pay portal currently today does not have access to the Social Security Death Master File as we speak. 3.5 years after the pandemic. I mean, that's a problem of data sharing and data and collaboration and creating data use agreements. The Pandemic Analytics Center of Excellence has created over 95 data use agreements between agencies. That's a model for what the government should do, but not in the IG community, in the management side of the house.
And as these recovered funds are coming back in to the Treasury, how does the government track these funds? Are there any transparency measures in place so that the public can watch and know the efficacy of recovering these funds and where they go?
Yeah, the Treasury has an Office of Recovery Programs, and they also have an Office of Payment Integrity, and both of those offices coordinate the systems that provide that information to the public. So really it is the Department of Treasury that tracks that information.
And how is that released to the public? Can we find that online on the Treasury's Twitter account?
I think the Department of Treasury is actually really working right now in its Office of Payment Integrity to improve that transparency and that public-facing websites, and those are happening right as we speak. I think that in the next year to 2 years, we're going to see a lot of improvement in the information that's shared to the public. The PRAC also has a pretty great website that provides a lot of that transparency.
Okay. I know I speak for many constituents that proactive communication about this and connecting that information to the public so they can have confidence in this would be, would be key.
Agreed.
Additionally, in my last minute, I wonder if you might be able to pinpoint any steps that we might be able to take, not only in preventing fraud, or cracking down on it once it occurred, but even putting steps in place to close the gaps to keep it from happening in the first place. Are there more point-to-point contacts that we can ensure that the money is getting directly where it needs to go, disseminating to local governments or nonprofit organizations first? any and all of the above, or if you have any insights as well.
Yeah, I think that maintaining integrity of the funding that's going to citizens, whether that's through federally funded state administered programs like SNAP or, some of these benefit programs that go through the states, or they're directly to the citizens from a federal agency. The importance is to identify quickly before the payment is made, and we've talked about this a bit today, whether or not the individual who's applying for that benefit is who they say they are and they're entitled to it. And that's going to require data sharing, data analytics, advanced analytics that can use, artificial intelligence and other tools. And it's very vital that agencies get those tools to be able to prevent fraud, waste, abuse in the future.
Thank you. Yield back.
He yields back. I now recognize Representative Musser from the great state of Pennsylvania for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Certainly thank you to all of our witnesses here today. A very important subject, very troubling subject. I don't think the American people or taxpayers really have an understanding of the level of fraud that's just come out of a relatively small agency like the SBA. It certainly makes you think what levels of fraud occur elsewhere. CMS, you name it. So we have a big problem with this, $5 trillion company of ours known as the United States federal government, and the $6 trillion of spending that takes place. So your ideas, your backgrounds, experiences are very helpful to us. So, we had the EIDL, the PPP, the ERTC. EIDL had a wildly unacceptable level of fraud, almost insane what occurred there. So the investigations need to take place. PPP was a lot less, particularly on a percentage basis. PPP needed to be rushed. EIDL needed to be rushed. So it's not necessarily about assigning blame or which administration, but a lot of times you got to focus on where the problem occurred in order to fix it. ERTC, I don't have the data in front of me on what type of fraud existed there. I don't think the employee retention tax credit, which is pretty important and is still going out in important ways. And I agree with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle that these were very important. I mean, we could have gone into a depression if we shut down businesses and did not fund them to keep their employees. I mean, we would have had serious problems. But on the same note, the level of fraud. So they say that an acceptable level of fraudulent activity could be 2 to 3, even 4%. In my business, and I probably had no business being in charge of our credit department, but we had AR at any given time at about $50-60 million, and we didn't write off bad debt. It was never higher than 1%, and we weren't all that sophisticated. So the idea that this occurs is crazy. So I think crazy. Now, on the same note, we have the IG coming in telling us that there's, what was it, I forget his numbers right now, $240 billion in fraud. And then the SBA administrator tells us it's $50 billion in fraud. I mean, well, that's a pretty wide spread of discrepancy. So that's also highly troubling. So back to Ms. Miller, your idea of the centralized anti-fraud. Look, the credit card companies, the banks do it. Why can't the SBA do it? And Mr. Breed, I'll start with you and just go right down the line. And what should we be doing? Can we put you in charge, perhaps?
Not sure I
And it's
would.
worth the money, by the way, right? With the type of billions and billions that we're talking about.
Certainly, having someone in charge of going after it, going after the loan monies that have been stolen is a great idea. I don't know that it ought to be any one person as opposed to a lot of people's job. It's a task too big for any one person. I'm not sure creating a new bureaucracy in government is really going to solve the problem. The ones that we have already haven't solved it. So it's we have to understand that if you're going to have free markets, if you're going to have a capitalist economy, there is going to be fraud. If you have a socialist economy, there will be fraud too. So we have to build anti-fraud protections into everything we do and be aware that there have to be limits on how many businesses we shut down, how fast we want to help people, things like that if we don't want the fraud to get out of control. But right now we have a problem of getting after the people before the money is all gone.
All right, so collections, enforcement, and what about prevention, Mr. Taylor?
Thank you, Congressman. It's about identity verification at the front end before these types of benefit programs go out. Implementing the IAL2 standard issued out by NIST is the first step. And being the fact that that's a government solution, that should be a nonpartisan issue.
Absolutely. Down the line, thank you.
Congressman, I want to reemphasize something that was kind of been lost. Let me make sure you all understand a couple of facts about fraud. The IRS does root canal audits on people, and they do root canal audits. They only find offshore accounts in 7%, illegal offshore accounts in 7% of those audits. The number one way the IRS finds fraud in offshore accounts is whistleblowers. Study after study shows the number one way that you find fraud is whistleblowers. And with all due respect, to just say, well, we're going to depend on the SBA folks, they're doing good work, but if you want to fight fraud, the way the private sector finds fraud is they have whistleblowers. The way the government is finding fraud is through whistleblowers.
I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's
Thank
time is up. I now recognize Representative Glusenkamp Perez from the great state of Washington for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Mr. Zerby, I appreciate those sentiments. You know, I think that people want to build a government that you cannot legislate good behavior. Good behavior comes from the heart. You can penalize bad behavior. You can incentivize good behavior. And I think we've really, in the committee hearing today, sort of beat to death this thing of we need to go after the bad guys. And it's costing us to not do that. But I really appreciated in your testimony, Congressman Breeden, that the idea of like normal people, small business owners, not having the time and the capacity to understand the bureaucracy of a government that is no longer operating at a human scale. So you just walk into this pit and fall through a problem, and then there goes your livelihood. And so I really appreciated you're putting things in plain English. What are the eligibility criteria? Can you read this if you have a reading disability? Or, what and who is doing that work? So I wondered if you could speak to how that was built in. Yes, sir, thank you.
Thank you, Congressman. I think that's terribly important. One of the things that we focus on as part of anti-fraud protections in every victim trust we do is to make sure that the communication of eligibility standards is as clear as you can make it. The entire Madoff Victim Trust, the plan wasn't written by a bunch of lawyers and a bunch of boilerplate. It's in frequently asked questions, plain English, because there are a lot of people who might file a mistaken application or one that they're not eligible for, but they don't understand that. So take that part of it off the equation.
Right, and it's who is at the table when these rules are being written. You don't have normal people. You have a Congress built out of a bunch of, frankly, lawyers and people who have grown up, and not the people who might be applying for these programs. And I think that's a real flaw.
Yes, but the laws can be complicated, but when you have a program that's going to make loans that has eligibility standards, that's where either an agency itself or in cases we do, the private sector, you spend a lot of time trying to write very clearly so people understand what's required and what isn't allowed. Mm-hmm. It doesn't mean people won't go ahead and violate. Sure. There will be some.
But we need to make it as easy as possible for people to do the right thing.
I completely agree.
So thank you for that. Ms. Miller, I also likewise appreciated your testimony. We had Inspector General Ware come in and testify a few months ago about the incredible work his office are doing to investigate these cases of potential fraud and recoup the stolen money. At the same time, he shared that his office had identified 90,000 actionable leads and that his office needs more resources to investigate these leads, and the DOJ needs more funding for attorneys to prosecute these fraudsters. 90,000 sure feels like a lot to me. Feels like he's got a lot on his plate, and I'm wondering, we are staring down the face of a shutdown here, so how is that going to affect the oversight and law enforcement community's ability to crack down on fraud? And is the government losing out on money that we could be recouping, would you say?
I mean, for sure. In short, he's going to lose the time of all the people who could be doing those investigations when the government shuts down.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you so much to all of our witnesses for being here, and thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
All right, next I want to now recognize Representative Stauber from the great state of Minnesota for his 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, and for all the witnesses, thanks for being here. Ms. Miller, congratulations on being a member of our Olympic team. I was an aspiring Olympic athlete. I wasn't good enough to make the Olympic hockey team, but I gave it my best shot. I always wanted to be an Olympic athlete. That was a goal of mine. I will say this, that Mr. Taylor, Mr. Muser just asked you, what's the biggest thing to stop fraud? And your answer was identity verification, correct?
That's correct, Congressman.
Just changing gears here, and then I'm going to get back to our subject. Would that be considered in the same light for our national elections?
Identity verification could go for any type of program, Congressman.
Thank you. Ms. Miller, with your experience, what do you think is the monetary amount of fraud that someone should go to prison for?
I don't have experience to make that decision.
Any idea? Any guess?
No.
Would it be 50,000, 100,000? The reason I'm asking this is this fraud was put on the American people. And there's people that didn't get EIDL loans that should have got it. And there's people that struggle to get PPP loans in a faster time frame and didn't. And it was taxpayer money that went out. Does anybody have an idea? The other three witnesses to my question to Ms. Miller, what should be the amount somebody should go to prison for stealing the taxpayers' money? What is it? Mr. Breeden.
Sir, I think the threshold of what can be prosecuted should be fairly low. The theory of broken windows in law enforcement, that you don't, just because somebody only broke one window, if that happens across an entire city, it can have a very bad effect. So the level ought to be low. Then you have to have prosecutorial discretion, where prosecutors have to look at it and say, is this an egregious fraud or is it not?
The broken windows theory, as a former police officer, I subscribe to that theory, absolutely. You know, in Minnesota, we had Feeding Our Future was a nonprofit meant to feed people. There was over $250 million of COVID-19 federal funds that were stolen, and these fraudsters bought luxury cars, real estate, and other unlawful futures. The Small Business Administration, I think, and our government, and our Inspector General, we need to hold these people to task. You know, we're talking about millions and millions of dollars, and Ms. Miller mentioned earlier in her testimony that some of these identity theft folks were not going to get the money back. To me, I understand, I mean, the broad spectrum of this, of the fraud. But we need to make a statement as a country. This is taxpayer money. And I guess a certain percentage is expected, but we have to go after it. We have to go after it to make the statement. Nobody should steal the U.S. taxpayers' money. And they did it during a pandemic when our nation was brought to her knees. And that's just simply wrong. And so the experience that you all have shared with us, there's so much knowledge here. And Mr. Breeden, I think that you being in the private sector, you had mentioned a couple of minutes ago that you're not a government employee and you're doing really good work. I don't necessarily subscribe to another government group or another committee. The private sector here has shown the way. We just have to listen and give you the authority and the ability and the staff to do what you do best. Obviously, the SBA has failed here. There's no question about it. I want to thank you for your testimony and just your years of experience. We need more of this. And this is a bipartisan issue that we need to work on. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I now recognize Representative La Lota from New York, great state of New York, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The great state of New York, sir.
Got it.
$200 billion. $200 billion. Let's put that in perspective. If Congress had that $200 billion back, we could give the average taxpayer a $2,000 tax cut. Or we could deter conflict with China by buying 4 new aircraft carriers, 8 new submarines, and 27 new Navy destroyers. Or we could fully fund the state and local tax deduction, which a lot of my constituents would like. $200 billion. Approximately 1 in 5 COVID loans were potentially fraudulent. Thank you, Chairman, for hosting this important meeting and shining a spotlight on this important issue that my constituents care a heck of a lot about, and for our witnesses for being here to help inform our committee on this issue. Despite the widespread fraud, the SBA has downplayed the fraud stolen from our fellow taxpayers and has given a free pass to anyone who's stolen less than $100,000 by refusing to investigate those smaller loans. The SBA's disregard for this issue is exemplified by the administrator's failure to testify before this committee's July hearing with the Inspector General. It's our job on this committee to fight waste, fraud, and abuse in the Small Business Administration, and that job is made much more difficult when the SBA administrator does not show up. That leads me to my first question, Mr. Taylor, sir. In an effort to expedite funds, the SBA did not check the do not pay lists before sending money out. Is that a normal procedure?
The self-certification allowed by SBA at the beginning of the pandemic was totally uncalled for and unprecedented.
And what's the effect on not doing that diligence?
The massive fraud that we are seeing today.
Mr. Breeden, you have quite the impressive resume, sir. I looked it up. Harvard Law, chairman of the SEC, and you're a native Long Islander, most importantly. So that well qualifies you to be on this panel. My question, sir, is what effect does the SBA's decision to not investigate those smaller loans have on future behavior?
I think it's very deleterious, sir. It sends a message that, okay, you can play around the edges and people just won't bother. And I think the principle that if you steal from your neighbors, you steal from your fellow citizens, that will always be a matter worthy of government's attention is the right message to send.
It's a behavioral thing, right? That if folks know
Very
there are
definite.
consequences to their negative behavior, they're less likely to conduct that negative behavior, no?
Yes, sir.
Mr. Taylor, back to you, sir. I know that we talked a little bit about Barbie before. We're going to do it just shortly once again. How can the private sector help to identify, to do identity verification better to help prevent fraud?
Thank you, Congressman. Getting back to the presentation attack detection that I was mentioning to the previous Congressman about, that would have stopped those types of attacks on those fintech platforms. The fraud that was experienced by specifically around the PPP, the top 12 lenders around that were all fintech platforms. They would have allowed something like that to go through. Currently, identity verification, whenever you implement liveness detection at the IAL2 that is approved by NIST, it stops that in its tracks. Additionally, SBA OIG, specifically IG Ware, talked about it the last time that he was here, talked about the overlapping of IP addresses and suspicious IP address activity. If this was 5 years ago, that's an effective way to go about doing an investigation. It no longer holds that value at the IP address level. You have to get into the big data that's associated with that IP address, as well as the device intelligence associated with it.
So doing things like that obviously come at a cost, right? That it takes more to invest in better technology, better process, that comes at a cost. Would you assess that as positive ROI? Is the return on that investment positive for the taxpayers? If we go through that diligence, raise the bar, do better identity verification, do we have less fraud? And is the less fraud worth? Does it give us extra money to pay for those costs, sir?
Yes, sir. As a matter of fact, everywhere that IDME has been implemented across 27 states during the pandemic, fraud rates went down, the pass rates went up. So it's a matter of inclusivity in these programs. It's a matter of stopping the fraud in its tracks, and also the false positives associated with misidentifying an individual, which you can do if you're just targeting an IP address. We are not allowed at ID.me. We have a policy. We keep the false positive rates very low, well below 1%. The fraud rates, the same thing. The fact that we're talking about programs that have 18, 21% and the fraud rate is unheard of in the private sector. So with that being said, I would be very cautious at any type of program that's concentrated only on the IP address. Additionally, in Puerto Rico, we took the pass rates from 23% up to 78% at a cheaper cost.
Thank you very much. My time has expired. Thank you, Chairman.
Now I recognize Representative Salazar from the great state of Florida for her 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This great state of Florida, indeed. And thank you for coming to explain to us your knowledge and everything, all the steps that you have taken. Mr. Taylor, I hear that in the state of Florida, you were able to establish a very good technique that we could replicate in the rest of the country. Could you please explain for my constituents, what did we do right in Florida versus other states?
Thank you, Congressman. The relationship with Florida has been an absolutely fantastic one.
Okay.
We've implemented the IL2 policy there that I spoke about previously.
Mm-hmm.
So the fact that you have identity verification gating a lot of the public benefit programs there
And how does that work in particular, so I can understand? I don't have a criminal mind, so I'm not sure what people think. What do you need to do in order to defraud the government? So why the facial identification is important?
The less about the facial recognition side and more about the actual liveness detection, the fact that a person is a real individual. The mask that made it through in the Barbie Swindler, those do not make it through ID.me in the state of Florida because we have that liveness detection built into the platform. Additionally, we have unsupervised side. So if a person can't get through, let's say that there's a language barrier, we support over 200 languages on that side, so the person can come through, talk to a trusted referee, and we're talking about wait times that are less than 5 minutes to get it onto those platforms. Lastly, I would turn your attention to Hurricane Ian last year. The devastating impacts with that, obviously in the billions of dollars in loss. We have a threat intelligence cell that lives out on the dark web that looks for fraudsters going after these types of benefit programs. We actively go out and look for the bad guys going after these public benefits, and we did that in the state of Florida. So much so that whenever Hurricane Ian occurred, we had the in-person terminals that ID.me has, and the people were able to verify their identity to get their FEMA funds right there on the spot instead of having to wait in line to go to a state office or something like that.
So the facial identification could be the answer for the federal government to stop future frauds in across the board or across the nation. Would you consider that?
It's one part of an entire fraud suite of tools that we would recommend.
All right. Explain to my constituents why, after the pandemic, we had so much fraud. I would imagine that people were claiming that they couldn't find work or that they did not have a job. Explain to me the scenario after COVID.
During the first 9 months of the pandemic, you had self-certification of these benefit programs. Combine that with the speed at which they were disseminated, you're talking about an unprecedented amount of capital that went out into the economy. That incentivized a lot of nation-state actors, as well as your traditional domestic fraudster, to go after these benefit programs.
Okay.
Your constituents have not only suffered from the standpoint of losing their identity, possibly for tax purposes or for filing for unemployment, but also they may have been inadvertently their identity used in a credit scheme that would target a small business.
Okay. So we know that the SBA, there's a dispute of the amount of money that went to the wrong hands through the PPP program. Do we have a figure of how much money went to the wrong hands or how many millions of dollars were lost for after the pandemic for claims from people that did not deserve or they were not the right beneficiaries of these monies for unemployment benefits?
Thank you, Congressman. I would agree with IG Ware that the likely fraud is somewhere in that realm of $650 billion, with that the fraud number right now that he's planning on going and prosecuting at $200 billion.
$200 billion. And this money that we're talking about is included in that figure of $200 billion.
That's correct, Congressman.
Okay. Thank you. Yield back.
Next, I now recognize Representative Phillips from the great state of Minnesota for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this hearing, and to all of you for being with us. Let me just start by saying I share every one of my colleagues' disgust by the scale of fraud that took place during the pandemic, and we got to do everything we can to investigate and, most importantly, recoup billions of dollars that were literally stolen from American taxpayers, during what I consider a tragic moment in our history. The good news, in my estimation, is that we've got a clear roadmap, and that is to give the SBA Inspector General the resources that his office needs to go after these fraudsters. I come from a business background myself, like the chairman, where return on investment is the name of the game. The IG's office has requested $47 million in discretionary funding for its operations in fiscal year 24. Unfortunately, the House Appropriations Committee underfunded that request by about $15 million. Yet over the past 2 years, OIG's efforts have yielded over $9 billion in financial accomplishments, recoveries, fines, and forfeitures. Considering these numbers, an extra $15 million, in my estimation, seems like a heck of a good return on investment to me. Inspector General Hannibal Ware has proven that his office delivers results for taxpayers, and Congress simply needs to give him the tools to do his job. So I'd welcome suggestions from our witnesses today, and we ought to consider them fairly, but we cannot lose sight of the fact that the number one thing we can do to recoup fraud is to fund the Inspector General's office fully. Let me just start with you, Mr. Zerbe. I really appreciate the bipartisan tone in your testimony. I think you're right that eliminating fraud, waste, and abuse at the SBA is a bipartisan exercise, must be bipartisan, in the same way that small business relief was. I'm intrigued by your proposal to establish a whistleblower program at the SBA. It's proven successful at other agencies, of course. But one of my concerns is that the IG currently lacks resources to actually investigate what I think are about 90,000 actionable leads that it has already identified. So what do you make of this concern?
Thank you for that, Congressman. I think a couple of thoughts for you. One is that I agree they've got kind of a fire hydrant drinking moment right here, but I still think that the whistleblowers will be able to, better target the most important fraud cases. And also, just so you understand, when you're submitting, particularly when you have an award program, it's not just a tip and things like that, the whistleblower, his attorneys, they're providing a whole package for the agency. I mean, we're putting in the documents, the material, a view of the law, a narrative. We want it on a T-ball for them to be able to just do it. So it's making the agency much more time efficient and effective in terms of what they're doing. One thing, too, to consider, you might think about as you're looking at legislation in this area, it's not uncommon for the whistleblower award programs and the key TAM programs and other agencies to allow for a reimbursement of the cost the agency hits with their investigation as well, too. In other words, yes, we've recovered these funds, and yes, we're going to reward the whistleblower, but we're also going to reimburse the SBA for its costs as well, too. So it may be something to consider to address the concern you've got about limited agency resources, to say, great, we're going to, in a sense, incentivize not only the private sector to come forward and assist the SBA through the whistleblowers, but we're also going to incentivize the SBA to embrace those whistleblowers and work with them, because then they'll basically be able to have their costs met. So that may be a way to address your concerns, Congressman.
And based on that absurdly high number, 90,000 leads, are there alternatives, concerning the resources, levers, tools we have available to us? In your estimation, are there other mechanisms that we should be considering to reduce that workload and ensure that every one of those leads is investigated?
Well, I think that's where it's going to help, not to repeat, but I think having seen a lot of these kind of tips, particularly more from my IRS work, a lot of them tend to be pretty threadbare. I mean, just, well, Jimmy's, got a fancy car and you guys should go look at him. Okay. I think, when you're getting the whistleblower, you're getting an insider informed and you're getting the big fish. Okay. So the SBA white...
So quality, not quantity.
Yeah, and the IG white paper highlighted one. They had one whistleblower who came forward, and it was over $600 million that they had identified thanks to this one whistleblower. So you're right. Okay. It's able to get the big fish and the worst actors, if you will, and target them better on that. Yes, Congressman.
Okay, I appreciate it. I've only got about 20 seconds left. I just want to refer to a letter that I plan to send to both the House and Senate Appropriations Committees requesting that they fulfill the OIG's full request of $47 million in discretionary funding, because holding these bad actors accountable should be bipartisan goals. and I surely invite my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to join me in that endeavor. And with that, Mr. Chair, I yield back with exactly 1 second left.
Great job. I'd like to thank our witnesses today for the testimony and for appearing before us. Without objection, members have 5 legislative days to submit additional materials and written questions for the witnesses to the chair, which will be forwarded to the witnesses. I ask the witnesses to please respond promptly. So if there's no further business without objection, the committee is adjourned. Thank you all very much.